AI can do amazing and wonderful things. And, we're all astonished every time we put a complicated question in and out comes the answer in 2 seconds. But actually, one of the things that AI cannot do is exercise judgment.
Welcome to Grit in the Boardroom, the podcast that takes you behind closed doors to unpack the pivotal decisions that shaped organisations for better or worse. I'm Erika Eliasson-Norris, and each week I sit down with a senior leader who stood at the edge of a defining moment. A crisis, a turning point, a challenge where the stakes were high and the outcome uncertain. These are the conversations you won't find in annual reports. Honest, strategic, and grounded in lived experience. Because governance isn't about theory, it's about pressure, people, and making the call. My guest today is Sir Andrew Likierman. He is one of the UK's most respected voices on leadership judgment, corporate governance, and decision-making at the highest levels. Former Dean and Professor of Management Practice at London Business School, he has combined academic insight with deep practical experience, serving as a non-exec director on more than 20 boards across sectors, including the Bank of England, Barclays Bank, Times Newspapers Holdings, and helping to shape UK corporate governance as part of the Cadbury Committee. Alongside this boardroom experience, he has advised the United Nations on governance. He has led the Government Financial Service at HM Treasury and spent decades studying how leaders make better choices in uncertainty with insights captured in his latest book, Judgment at Work. Welcome to Grit in the Boardroom, Andrew. Let's get into it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Sir Andrew, you've spent decades in boardrooms across sectors. Which moment comes to mind when you think about judgment shaping a company's fate?
Well, when you use the word fate, of course, then it implies drama, it implies conflict, it implies lots of things where you've got a really big issue and big stakes and so on. And so inevitably, it's mergers and acquisitions that come to mind in terms of the big moments in a company's life and history. In fact, though, I think that judgment's an incredibly important element of everything a board does and doesn't do. I mean, it's the thing it leaves out as well as the things it actually does. But mergers and acquisitions is the big area here.
And was it the case that good judgment made the difference between the right and the wrong kind of answer or outcome?
Yes, I've been involved in a number of discussions and negotiations and outcomes. And what's completely clear is that judgment, the way the board approached this, was absolutely critical in terms of the future of the company. And the evidence seems to show, in general, that the people who gain most from an acquisition are the shareholders of the company that's being acquired. That's to say, very many acquisitions have very poor outcomes, and it's a problem in getting value for money in terms of a takeover.
Why is that? What do you think is kind of one of the grounding issues that means that, as you say, the shareholders of the companies being taken over actually could end up in a better position than anyone else, any of the other stakeholders?
Well, this links to the work I've done on judgment. And one of the things that it seems to me is incredibly important in the way people make choices is the feelings and the emotions that they have. And feelings and emotions run high often in these situations, and companies seeking to take another one over often are in the grip of a huge desire to go through with the deal. And sometimes, not inevitably, but sometimes embarrassing facts come to light during the negotiations, for example, and they're disregarded because everybody's so mad keen to do the deal that they kind of ignore these inconvenient facts. So that's a kind of example of feelings and beliefs getting in the way.
Yeah. Do you think ego has anything to do with that?
Oh, yes. I mean, it would be naive not to believe that ego doesn't have a part to play. To be fair, though, I don't think it's true that it's all driven by ego and that leaders are all about themselves and they don't think about my experience has been on the contrary, that people running organizations on the whole are pretty professional about what they do. They will not do things on whims. Now, there are people who do things on whims and there are people who do things based entirely on emotion. And some of them get away with it. It's fine, and it all ends well. But one has to understand that a risk is being taken here, and sometimes the risks pay off. What we know very often is the risks don't pay off.
What do you think stood out for you on how the board navigated that uncertainty in that moment?
Well, as I said, I've had experience of quite a lot of different events of this kind. It is a moment of drama. It is a moment in which a great deal is at stake. Assumptions are made. People have to come to a view, often against deadlines, and that's a tough thing to do. And on the whole, organisations who have good managers, good leaders, will be tending to make these decisions on a more rational basis than those that don't. Now, I mention rational because I've also mentioned emotion here, and I'm not excluding the fact that emotion plays a good part in these things. But those who use their mind as well as their gut in deciding what to do will tend to come out better. You can use your gut, you can take a big risk, but it is a risk. And, a lot is at stake here, particularly in terms of mergers and acquisitions.
Have you got an example you can give where that was the case?
Well, let me take one that I wasn't involved in because it's in the public domain and easier, which is the takeover by Royal Bank of Scotland of ABN Amro, where on the back of a successful merger, or rather takeover by RBS of NatWest, the board were very, very confident about their abilities, and the chief executive in particular was very confident about his ability to do this. And the kind of incredibly complicated issues attached to this multinational merger were, it appears, rather swept aside in the fact that, we are wonderful, we can do things, and, what is to stop us? And it all ended, as we know, in tears, and not just for the shareholders of RBS.
And do you think that those outcomes would have been the same but for a different set of board members?
I'm absolutely sure they would. If you undertake a huge merger of this kind, very, very complicated, which involves partners, which involves divestments, the question of the use of cash rather than shares and so on. These were really big stakes involved. And all right, it's easy in retrospect to say that all ended really badly, but I think it must have been clear at the time that this was a huge risk.
And how do you think board members can prepare themselves for something like this?
Well, what you need, unsurprisingly, since I write about judgment and talk about judgment, what you need, I believe, as a board member, as a company, is to have board members who have good judgment. In other words, they look at what is going on here. They're aware of the fact that feelings and beliefs are involved, and so on. They want to know who and what to trust. These kinds of elements, which for me constitute judgment, are a really important part of what a board has to have in order to achieve its objectives. And the difference between boards with and without these seems to me pretty significant.
And it's judgment, I suppose, reflection on what they are bringing to the table, as well as reflection on what they are hearing from other people, because everybody works, I presume, on their own level of judgment, and they bring that to the boardroom. You can end up with a lot of biases, for instance, around the table. That person themselves also needs to be able to call out their own biases, no doubt, to be able to say, actually, I'm feeling that because something's happened and I've experienced this before, I feel that this is not a good idea or this is a good idea. How can people be objective about themselves in that situation where there's high pressure and drama?
Look, I don't think you can simply say, I have no biases, or indeed, you can say, I'm going to get rid of all my biases. It's simply not realistic. We're human beings. And so what we have to do, I believe, is to be aware of our biases. And I tell the story in an organisation which I was running. One of my colleagues came to me and said, Andrew, I think you're a little bit cautious. And I was a bit surprised by this. I thought, oh, me? No, I don't think that's probably right. And then gave some evidence about this. Now, that was a very good example, and I took that seriously, and I thought, actually, that's right. being aware thereafter of my tendency to be cautious then helped me, I believe, in making better choices. So I think as long as everybody's aware, what their biases are, what they tend to do, are they always optimistic about absolutely everything turning out brilliantly? Well, you need to know that before you plunge yourself into something. And similarly, like me, let's say you're too cautious, maybe you don't take enough risk. So being aware of one's biases and one's feelings and beliefs seems to be really at the heart of this.
And how can people improve their self-awareness?
There's lots of ways of doing it. It's a board appraisal, normally speaking, should be an important part of that every year, so that when you get feedback on how well you're doing, how badly you're doing, what you're doing particularly, and so on, that's the kind of thing that ought to come up. And I've found myself that board appraisals and board reviews each year are really, really helpful in terms of identifying things that you may not know about yourself and that your colleagues help you to get better at. So I'm a great fan of board review because I think that actually is a way in which boards do get better. As individuals, we can become more aware of ourselves. There's plenty of ways of doing that. Simply getting mentoring or coaching or something like that can help you as an individual to become better. So I think there's actually lots of ways in which you can get to know yourself. This was something that back in ancient Greece, as it were, they talked a lot about, and it still applies today.
There are many examples of boards that have had board appraisals and have gone on to have corporate scandals or collapse or whatever else very soon after. What do you think are some of the key things that boards should kind of think about when they have their reviews to make sure it's not just, a pat on the back and and it's ceremonial, as opposed to actually making the change or calling things out that really do need to be called out for the kind of long-term sustainability of that organisation?
Well, look, there's a requirement to have board reviews for listed companies in a number of countries, and that seems to me really sensible. It doesn't say you've got to have a great board review or a board review that really tells you what's going on. Actually, board reviews can be rubbish. You know what I mean? There you can simply get somebody in to go through the motions, number one. Secondly, you can have a board review where nobody takes any action as a result of the board review. So you've gone through the motions, okay, but nothing actually happens or changes. And I've known organizations where people are too polite, or too afraid to address particular issues or particular people. And so there's no guarantee a board review will do the business. But actually, if done well, being done well means usually being done by outsiders if possible, because insiders are a problem in terms of confidentiality and so on. And having the right kind of structured review, having then it followed through by the chair talking to each individual board member or whatever it is, and the senior independent director talking to the chair, these are ways in which you can actually make a review work. So, of course, there are companies that have gone horribly wrong after board reviews because they've had to do the board review. But it may not be the board review that was the problem. Otherwise, it may be the board review that was the problem because they didn't address the issues.
Yes, I've been in situations and experienced kind of companies whereby board reviews have very much been toned down before they even reach the board. So the chair and maybe the CEO will review what's been drafted by an external independent, and little did the rest of the board know, or were they even aware that actually what then went to the board was a sanitised version with everything stripped out that could possibly be helpful to improve.
Well, I'll give you two examples. In one case, I was on a board where the board appraisal took place. The chair talked to the board member after the review was done, and the man resigned immediately. Basically, he had lost the confidence of his colleagues, and the chair did not hide this from the individual, as some chairs would. And basically, he said, in that case, I'm going. He resigned the same day. Quite right. I was on the board with him, and he was useless. All right. So that was a good outcome, I think, for the organization. And I'll give you another example. So on a board review that I was involved in, so I was the person being reviewed, and the chair said to me, Andrew, you know something? You're quite aggressive. And I said, me? I'm such a nice person. I'm aggressive? Me? Good heavens. And he said, well, yes, when you ask questions, you ask them in a pretty aggressive way. I mean, you're not nasty, but it's aggressive. So I walked out of the room and I thought, well, I don't think this is right, actually. I think this is a bit of a mix-up here. Anyway, the next board meeting, put up my hand and started asking a question, and I just listened to myself asking the question, and it was very aggressive. And I had simply not been aware of the fact that although I thought this was, a penetrating question asked in a nice way, it was actually, the tone was quite wrong. And again, that was very helpful to me in toning down the way I then asked. I hope I kept on asking good questions, but I didn't ask them in such a nasty way.
Well, it comes down to self-awareness, right?
It does, exactly.
I think the chair's position can be particularly challenging. They may have to deliver feedback to peers or others that maybe they don't want to hear. What do you think are some of the kind of key things that chairs can do to prepare themselves for that sort of experience? Because it's very different, right, from moving from a non-exec director role to a chair. And often people kind of think, well, it's just the person that's leading the group. It can be quite different, right?
It is very different. And I do think that being a chair is a really skilled thing to do. And sadly, a lot of chairs are not very skilled because they haven't had the experience, they haven't had the training, they haven't had the feedback. And quite a lot of people become chairs and think, well, now I do whatever I want, really, and people are too scared, perhaps. And sometimes, they don't want to cause trouble, whatever it is. So the chair gets away with an awful lot. Now, it seems to me in terms of what chairs need to do, chairs need to get good feedback on how they're doing. And again, the senior independent director has a role here to do that and act as a formal channel, as it were, so people can say, look, the wrong things are coming on the agenda, or X and Y get a lot of airtime and A and B are ignored, these kinds of things. So the senior independent director can do a lot to help the chair. But the chair really, has the responsibility to act on behalf of the organisation and it not just to be a big ego trip, for the chair, because it's all very well, people often love being chairs because they're kind of in charge of the agenda, in charge of the meeting. What could be nicer? They love the sound of their own voice. When I've joined boards, after a while, I began to ask if I was approached to join a board, I would look first at the chair. And if my sense was this was a lousy chair, then I wouldn't accept going on the board, even though it was a lovely idea and I liked the idea of the company, because I knew the meetings would not be good.
And what do you mean by not be good?
Well, we've all been in meetings, haven't we? On and on, sit there for hours. We've already agenda items. Everybody knows what the outcome's going to be, but we've gone through a 60-slide presentation, and lots of discussion about what exactly? Have anybody advanced their views? Very often people end up with exactly the same views as when they started, that kind of thing. I mean, for me, my bugbear is meetings that last too long, and hence I've mentioned that. But also chairs who don't bring in the expertise around the table, who ignore certain kinds of people that they don't like and bring in others that they do like, or, support their point of view. I mean, the most brilliant chair I ever saw was a man called Ron Deering, long dead, Lord Deering, who came from very humble background, rose to be chairman of the post office, then went to the House of Lords. And his chairing of a meeting was completely brilliant. There wasn't anything which wasn't carefully focused on getting through the agenda, not because he had a view, because he wanted to get the best out of the room. And so people were asked for their contributions. He thought beforehand, who shall I bring in to talk about this? He brought them in because they had something to say. If he knew somebody who was counter that, he would ask somebody, I understand you're not in favour of that. Could you explain why? So he guided the discussion without ever pushing the board to a conclusion. I mean, it was a work of art to see him as a chair.
And I presume that's not in any textbook or any course that people just sign up to and do a day and all of a sudden they become an amazing chair. How do you learn these sorts of skills, or is it by experience?
I think it's back to the business of, yes, it's experience, but also being willing to learn, getting feedback, trying to be better. And I come back to it, realizing that you have responsibilities to the people in this room and to the organization. This is not simply a vehicle for your views and your ideas about life, even though you have the chair.
I had a very interesting conversation not that long ago with somebody that was talking about succession and particularly CEOs. And they were talking about how you hire CEOs, and they were talking about kind of psychological type testing way beyond, psychometrics and those sorts of things. More what sort of an individual is that, and how will that impact the organization? And actually, this particular person spoke about the fact that you need to go through kind of tests and things if you are a bus driver or if you're an airline pilot, but you're not expected to go through the same sort of tests as a CEO of a business that could affect many, many hundreds of thousands or even millions of people. What do you think about that?
Well, look, it's absolutely right. This is not something where you do some psychometric tests, and fit into something or ask ChatGPT, who's the best candidate. No doubt this will happen increasingly. I mean, what you need is, who is the right person for this group of people at this time? And, you may want a CEO who has certain characteristics for a company at one stage of its existence and a rather different kind of person at a different stage. And to face certain kinds of circumstances where you've got dynamic growth, you don't necessarily need the same person to lead that as the person who's leading a kind of steady as she goes approach to make sure the organization doesn't run out of money, is well run and so on, and seen to be right. So I think it's very much a question of saying who is right in these circumstances for this situation. And coming back to my own subject of judgment, it seems to me the one thing you need, doesn't matter what else you have or don't have in somebody, is judgment. Because if they don't have judgment, frankly, it can be a bit of a nightmare. You never know what they're going to do or how they're going to react to things. You need that kind of quality to make sure that they actually are able to understand a situation and respond to it and take action accordingly.
Andrew, you mentioned a little bit about ChatGPT and digital technology. Looking at how boardrooms might evolve over time, have you got any insights into what you think might happen or the impact that might have, particularly around judgment?
Well, yes, because I would argue that AI can do amazing and wonderful things. And, we're all astonished every time we put a complicated question in and out comes the answer in 2 seconds. And we all think, God, that's amazing, fantastic, and so on. But actually, one of the things that AI cannot do is exercise judgment. It is programmed by people with biases, with views, and so on. The data is trained by people. You have to know what question to ask, the prompt you give it. You've got to interpret the results, so on. Somebody had to program it. So AI is not a person. It is a thing programmed, interpreted by us. And as I say, it's wonderful what it can do. But we do have to interpret what comes out of it. And I'll just give you one example. I asked ChatGPT the other day, do you tend to be more positive than negative? And the answer came out, I am more positive, and that is by design. And it gave a series of reasons why it tended to be more positive in the outcome. Now, there you are. There's a great example. I'm not saying it isn't lovely to have constantly positive responses. And the way, it gives these answers, it's so chatty and nice. It all feels as if it's coming from another person, and that person is completely objective. It isn't another person, and the person isn't objective. So in a world of AI, people have a great deal to contribute, and that applies also on the board.
Mm. And people are starting to use AI for minutes and for recording conversations that took place. Obviously, there's a certain amount of admin that gets taken out of the whole process if that happens. But I guess there are some challenges around that, right? Particularly around the emotion in the room and other such things, and the way that people exercise their judgment and biases and things that may be apparent to a human, let's say, but not to a piece of technology. How do we navigate that sort of thing?
You're absolutely right. One thing, for example, if you think about it, a machine does not have is consciousness. all right? It's the kind of thing which picks up what consciousness picks up. So in terms then of how this can be applied, it's wonderful. I mean, it's fantastic that you can actually get it doing the minutes, as it were, and so on. But, and this is the same but in every field, including, for example, the use of AI in medicine, you can ask the question, but you need to monitor to make sure that the answer is, corresponds to what you understand the situation to be. So it can't write the minutes and then say, well, that we don't have to worry about it. Somebody's got to read through these brilliantly assembled minutes and make sure that it actually has captured what goes on. Just as, if you ask a machine in the field of medicine I mentioned, it can do fantastic things on the mechanics of the body. But as soon as you've got any human emotion involved and psychology or comorbidity and so on, you need a human being to do quite a lot of interpreting. My sense is I'm very optimistic about AI. I believe it'll do wonderful things that were often drudgery and, not, and make us more productive. But it's going to be us plus machines, not one or the other.
I've even heard surgeons say that they won't take somebody into surgery if they have a very pessimistic view of their own ability to be able to get through, for instance. But actually on paper, it may look like they absolutely need what they need to have done. And I've got friends that have turned around and said, actually, we said no, that you come back another day and think about it and think about the upside and the positivity, because we can't have you going in, which is an element that technology can't yet do.
Yeah, and you say not yet. The technology will get better. It'll, at the moment we've got hallucinations, we've got things made up, so it'll get better at that. Of course it will. What it can't do is it can't know what it doesn't know. If things are not in the public domain, if they're in people's minds, if they're not registered, the machine by definition can't know about them. So that's one of the reasons why. So there's a number of reasons why it simply won't just be the inevitable march of the machine.
And taking it back to independent judgment, what do you mean with regards to boards when you say that they need to exercise independent judgment? And what is it and why is it important? And how do you actually do that in practice?
I wrote a booklet for the Charter Governance Institute on this because, having done my work on judgment, I was struck as a director by the fact that as a director, one is obliged by law, Section 173 of the Companies Act in the UK, to exercise independent judgment. I thought, really interesting. Where's the definition of independent judgment? And there is no definition of independent judgment. In other words, directors are required by law to exercise something that is not defined. So I thought, okay, well, I'll try and help here. And so I talked to a lot of directors about this. I talked to people who had worked in this field and so on. And I came up with a number of ways, mainly based on examples of what independent judgment means. The law, for example, says it's all about conflicts of interest and so on, and being independent from that. But for me, it's also a branch, as it were, of the general area of judgment. The question, for example, of you are presented with figures and facts. You look at the person and you think to yourself, do I trust this person? That is part of independent judgment, because simply taking things on trust from somebody, without understanding whether it needs to be vetted or not, does not seem to me independent judgment. It's simply taking things as they're given to you. So that's just one example. And I go through a number of ways in which directors can think about the question of how they exercise independent judgment, and I hope offer some guidance. So I think it's really important for a board, because people who can exercise independent judgment are really valuable to the organisation.
And how do you think boards should balance data, experience, timing and instinct?
Well, look, boards are always balancing. There's no limit to this. I mentioned the endless meeting, the one that goes on too long. On the other hand, you don't want to rush through the agenda. I've been a chair, and board members have come to me afterwards and said, you rushed it. You know what I mean? This was too short, actually. You were too keen to get to the end. And I acknowledged that was so, that simply you're always balancing. Is there enough data? Is there enough information here? In terms, you mentioned instinct. I'm I'm not a great instinct fan. I mean, instinct I think is fantastic. On my bike around London, I need to know what's going on around me. And if my instinct is this lorry here is about to turn left in front of me, that's the kind of thing where instinct is really valuable. Similarly, if one's in danger or whatever it is. But I mean, most cases, instinct is a very animal thing. It's about us simply responding to certain kinds of stimuli. And I think board members need to do a bit more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting. I think from some of the conversations I've been having with people, we kind of get back to the fact that we are animals, we are human, and yet sometimes we put ourselves in a box where we think that we are just invincible and we know everything and we can do everything. And I guess that comes back to the self-awareness kind of piece.
Absolutely. And if I can pick up another word here, intuition. I mean, intuition is often regarded rightly as being a valuable thing to have. And linking this, I would say, to my judgment work, I would say, if you've done something 50 times before and number 51 time comes up, you're in a pretty good position to think about your intuition here, because your intuition is actually your accumulated experience. If you've never done something before and it comes up, then intuition is not a good guide because you don't have any knowledge about this. It's the first time. And simply going from the gut, is really taking a risk again. I would say if something comes up which is completely new, then intuition is not necessarily where you should be looking, frankly. You need to do a bit more than that because you don't have the background and the knowledge and the experience to make that intuition work for you.
Do you think we are reducing the amount of intuition we have as a species, particularly with over the course of time, maybe with AI and whatever else, we're relying on something else as our answer to the problem? And if you take us back to kind of caveman days, intuition had to be exceptionally high, that you kind of just felt that camping down somewhere in particular could actually lead to your death or your downfall. We don't have half as many issues and challenges as we did back then. How do we kind of navigate that now? Some people have more intuition than others, I'm sure.
I pride myself on being an expert on one or two things, but cavemen is not one of them, I'm afraid. So I can't really comment on that side of things. I'd find it quite difficult to say, are we relying more or less on our intuition? Some people clearly set great store by their intuition, and it's part of the way they operate as individuals. And I'm not saying that's wrong, and somehow that people who don't have no intuition are better than those who have got lots of intuition, as it were. But what you want with intuition is you want good intuition, and I'm saying I think you stack the cards in your favor of good intuition by using experience. I mean, going for something without evidence, without data, for the first time, purely on the basis of intuition, is just risky. It's not the end of the world, it's just risky. And if the stakes are low, it's fine. Should I take that chocolate bar or the other chocolate bar? Well, all right. It's not the end of the world here. Should I marry X or Y? Probably better to get a few facts first, I think.
Absolutely. I've been on a board before where I highlighted to the chair that one of the people within that board, one of the executives, was definitely not the right person for the role, put it that way, and kind of moving more towards something that if it hit the frontline newspapers, definitely wouldn't have been something anybody would have been happy with, let's put it like that. A number of the people on the board, after I had raised factual information about the challenges that I'd faced, they were very aware of it, and they thought, oh, actually, I thought that, but I didn't. Oh, actually, when you look back, and I think sometimes people don't necessarily use that intuition all the time, and they just cast it aside and just think, oh, but it'll be okay, or not a problem, until something comes up, and then all of a sudden the house of cards falls, and people start to think, actually, maybe when I piece everything together, I knew more than I thought I did, or felt more than I thought I did.
I think that's a very good example of when intuition is indeed valuable. Having a feeling that something isn't quite right. I mean, this for me is part of the awareness element of judgment. You just feel this person doesn't sound quite right, or, this email looks dodgy, or whatever it is. And you think to yourself, wait a minute, what's going on here exactly? And as you say, the difficulty then is to say, do you translate that feeling into a question on a board? I mean, I can think of a couple of occasions where I had also, I wished now that I had followed my intuition. But at the time I thought, well, I'm not sure I'm right there. And actually it would have been better for me to speak up. And other occasions where I did speak up. So it's, I don't think I've got a sort of zero score here, but I do think there is room for intuition here. But it is asking the question, which is a great way to do it, rather than making an irrevocable choice on the basis of no evidence.
Can you take us inside a room where judgment was tested and where that shifted the decision? So kind of moved from A to B as a result of being able to apply some of these things.
Yeah. I mean, I can think of it in an example of the firm was being encouraged by one of the biggest firms in the industry to take over another firm in order to safeguard its future. Now, they wanted to make sure they had the continuing market available. So they didn't want to take it over, but they encouraged us to do that. And it looked like a sort of very good deal. I mean, here they were with the agreement of the management saying, will you take it over? Now, actually, in the room, with nobody, only the board members present, the question then was, are we at risk here? Where are other things we simply don't know about? The decision was taken, and that was a very good decision. It would only be done if this firm doing the encouraging, the jumbo firm in the industry, would give certain kinds of guarantees of certain kinds, and otherwise we would walk away from the deal. And they did give the guarantees, and the guarantees were needed because this turned out to be a real turkey.
Wow.
I mean, and they didn't know it, but we thought, we're at risk here. It's all very well for them to say, look, you've got this wonderful opportunity, but actually it's not their money at risk, it's our shareholders' money at risk. So that was, I think, an example of just stepping back for a moment, because of course everybody was very keen to do it. It looked like a great deal, good economically, good for the share price. Everybody would be really pleased with it and so on. But then we thought, wait a minute, what's going on there exactly? We don't know enough. I mean, we'd done some due diligence, but we didn't know enough. So that, I think, was a good example of judgment at work.
It can definitely be one of those things, due diligence. I've worked in businesses that have gone through all that sort of process. And sometimes you come out the other end and think, okay, I've written many, many words on a bit of paper about this, but actually we still haven't got to the heart of whether this is a good idea or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, as where we started with mergers and acquisitions, this, of course, is where the stakes are very high and people have not done it before, and often the knowledge is not there. You don't have all the facts. Are all these key people going to leave the firm as soon as it's taken over? Will they cash in their chips? There's hundreds of different things that one needs to think about.
So what can boards do in those sorts of kind of high-risk moments where they have to make a decision quickly? How can they try and make sure that that decision is grounded in the best possible routes, essentially?
Well, I think this comes back to the elements of judgment. So the knowledge and experience. What do we know? And what do we not know? And what do we not know that we don't know? I mean, there's traditional variation of that. How much experience have we got in this kind of work? Do we trust people? Do we trust the data? Can we trust what's going on? Are we aware of all the situations that we're letting ourselves in for? What are our feelings and beliefs here? Have we actually looked at all the elements of the choice? We've got this or this. Is there a third option? We could do something slightly different. And also, particularly in this case, is the question of can we deliver? This is the sixth element of my judgment framework. And in many cases, it's not a question of saying it's great in theory. The question is, can you actually do it? Have we got the people? Have the people got the bandwidth in order to carry this through? It's all very well saying, we're mad keen on expansion. It's absolutely fantastic. But I can think of one public company, which expanded very rapidly, and they just lost complete control of the company. It was all very well having all these acquisitions, but actually it lost control, delayed its accounts, share price went down, plummeted, as they say. These are the kinds of things.
And If our audience adopts one new habit to improve their own judgment, what would you recommend?
Look, I'd say it's a question of looking at yourself and saying, where are the things that I'm strong? Where are the things that I'm not so strong? And on the not so strong bit, saying, all right, can I make up for my relative weaknesses by getting other people to do this, being advisors or helping me to do this? Can I improve myself? We're all different, and all of us have got relative strengths and weaknesses. So I think it's a question of identifying it for yourself and then focusing on that to get yourself better.
And final question, do you feel that there's a single question that you ask yourself before making a decision that might be helpful to our audience?
I'm not sure there's a single question, because even, for example, of where if you've got to take a decision quickly, you can't hang around thinking, oh, have I gone through all the factors? Do I think if you've got to be quick, you've got to be quick. If it's a low risk item, it doesn't really matter, frankly, But I would say, if you're making an important choice, I think you need to ask yourself, even if it's for a fraction of a second, have I thought about the kinds of things I ought to be thinking about right now? Have I got to take this irrevocable decision right now? Sometimes you got no choice, you may get it wrong, but you've got no option. But if you have the luxury of a bit of time, it is really worth thinking about the process, about how you've come to your conclusion.
Andrew, thank you for joining me on Grit in the Boardroom and for bringing such clarity and good judgment and showing us what it really means for the boardroom.
Thank you very much for having me.
I think there are a number of key points from the conversation with Andrew today. I think that he drew on the fact that intuition is so vitally important, and maybe it's an underutilized skill by some, and something that we can all look to improve upon. That chairing is an art. He touched on that himself, about how important it is to be able to get a good chair and how he decided not to join certain boards if the chair didn't appear to be that great, and how much that can lead an organisation positively or negatively. And also around AI, how important it is for us to obviously use the technology, embrace the technology. It's fantastic, just as Andrew said. But we also need to be really aware that it only understands and has knowledge of what it has in the public domain and what it has access to. So we need to make sure that we're always looking at things with our own independent judgment to be able to assess whether or not that's something that we ourselves would want to stand behind and back. That's it for this episode of Grit in the Boardroom. Thanks to Andrew for sharing his story with honesty and insight, and thank you for listening. If you found this conversation valuable, please follow the show and share it with someone who leads through complexity. Until next time, stay thoughtful, stay brave, and stay in the room.